The Octarine Tree, a podcast exploring the meaning of ecology, spirit, and human relationship. From southwestern Australia, I'm your host, Byron Joel. G'day mob, welcome back to the Octarine Tree podcast. Today we are talking with another old mate of mine, Pat Simmons Jr. I first met Pat about 10 years ago working at a permaculture institute, the Permaculture Research Institute of Australia in northern New South Wales. I was working there and he was a student. I remember we went out one night to the local pub, it was karaoke night, and Pat sung a version of the Doobie Brothers, Listen to the Music, I think it was, that was a little too good, suspiciously good. And as it turns out, Pat Simmons Jr., funnily enough, is the son of Pat Simmons Sr., the singer-songwriter from the Doobie Brothers. Pat Jr. went on to develop really interesting permaculture projects in Maui, which is what we largely speak about. His time in Maui and the Hawaiian Islands, his discovery of the Hawaiian traditional agricultural systems and cultural systems at large. He's lived there for 25 years. He's not Indigenous Hawaiian, although he's quite deeply connected to the Indigenous community in Maui. But over his time there, studying permaculture, working on his own property, and following his nose, he's developed a pretty thorough appreciation for and understanding of how Maui works in terms of the human-country connection and growing food in particular. We explore in today's chat the Doobie Brothers, the record rain happening in Maui at the moment. Actually, it's worth noting today, while we were talking, there was record rainfall in Maui, and they actually, in the last few days, they've received a tsunami warning, and during this interview, he receives a flood warning or two. The reception wasn't great. It's not bad, but from his end, it's a little bit hard to hear at sometimes, at some point, so I do apologise. We also discussed the Evergreen State University, which some of you may recognise the name of for Brett Weinstein's involvement in what went down there. Terence McKenna, Traditional Ag Systems of the Islands, Maui History, Psychedelics, surprise, surprise, and Hawaiian Sovereignty. So without further ado, my mate, Pat Simmons Jr. Pat Simmons Jr., how are you, mate?
I'm good. Good to be here. Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. Now, when was the last time we actually hung out in the flesh? It was when you came through Fremantle?
Yeah, that concert with Dave Matthews was there.
Yeah, Dave Matthews was there, and I actually have a photo of me raiding your dad's rider. I'll send it through, actually. It's quite funny. Like, I think you took it. I was like eating all their burritos and stuff. But and Elvis Costello was there, and John Mayer was there.
I think Michael Franti, maybe.
Yeah, I think you're right. It was Fremantle Blues and Roots.
Yeah, I've got a photo of me on your friend's shoulders. Somebody has shoulders. That somebody who's intoxicated.
Yeah, it was a good time. It was the Frio Blues and Roots Festival, I think. Like, do you remember what year that would have been? Like
2014.
14. Okay, cool. Yeah, that was really a blast. You hooked us up with tickets, and then I remember you excusing yourself, like going, "Oh, I've got to go do something, guys. I'll be back." And then the next thing you knew, you came on stage with the Doobies. It was pretty cool.
Yeah. That's my thing when I'm out there with.
Yeah, it was awesome. Let's start at the beginning. I'd like to get a bit of an idea of your background. Where were you born and raised?
Well, I was born in a little rural town on the coast of Northern California called Fort Bragg. It's in Mendocino County, so it's in the redwoods, in the Great Redwood Forest of Northern California. And I was born there and lived there for the first handful of years of my life, and of course traveled in and out of there with my family, with music and everything.
Yeah.
But that was my home base. and kind of grew up in that coastal, chilly, foggy, seaport kind of vibe. And then when I was 4 years old, my dad bought property over here in Maui, Hawaii. And even before he bought it, we were coming over here to visit as just tourists a couple times. And
so he felt an affinity towards it? He
did. He likes it. He always really loved everything about Hawaii history, and just the culture. And he was always fascinated by it. And, you know, where we lived in Northern California, it was like a 4-hour drive just to get to the airport, where my dad would have to fly out, and he would be working all the time, every month, flying in and out.
Right.
It was a lot of driving for him, and he really wanted to go somewhere that you didn't have to be in the cold as well, because it was pretty chilly where we lived up there.
Yeah.
And rainy most of the year. Even in the summertime, it's pretty chilly.
Yeah.
And yeah, you got land here in Hawaii, and that's where I live right now. And we've, you know, when he first got the land, we used to come over and visit the property that we bought, and it was just raw land. It was old cattle land.
Yeah.
And jungle.
Is that the same patch of dirt that he's on now, or have you moved since?
That's the same. So that's the same property we're on now. Yeah, I was raised here. My dad bought this property in 1994. I was 4 years old.
Right.
And we ended up building a couple homes on it. And then in 1996 or 97, I was just about 6 years old, and we moved into the property here.
Okay.
And that's where I've stayed ever since. I've done my travels and gone off to university and all that.
What was your university experience? I've not talked to you about that before.
Yeah, I actually had a really unique experience. You know, growing up here, I went through the public school system, Hawaii public school system, up until high school.
Yeah.
Which was really not very enjoyable. The social life of school was great growing up, but I knew from a young age that the indoctrination that I was receiving from just loads of homework, and I already knew at a young age that I was just not cut out for it, the academics and all that. I did great. I did fine in school. I passed, but ended up learning about this alternative college called Evergreen State College.
You went to Evergreen?
Which is in Olympia, Washington. I went to Evergreen.
Yeah, I'm very familiar with Evergreen since the Brett Weinstein incident.
Funny.
Yeah, go on. That's very fascinating. I had no idea.
I went there. Yeah, I had heard from a friend about, I had this elder uncle friend of mine who's a Chinese doctor here, Chinese herbalist here in Maui. And he's like this old hippie guy that's been in Maui since the 70s. Yeah. But he's really into health and nutrition and spirituality and Taoism. And he kind of was one of my mentors growing up. And he told me about it. He went to Naropa in Colorado and in the 60s, 70s. And he told me about Evergreen. Yeah. And thought that I might like that. And then I found out about that, and that was the direction I went. But at the time, I was not at all interested in environmental studies.
Okay.
I was really into music and film and photography, actually. I was really into film.
Is that what you were studying?
So when I first got there, it's a funny story. When I first arrived at Evergreen, I'd already been kind of a hippie growing up and was drawn toward the alternative educational experience. But when I went to school there, I actually ended up signing up late for classes, and a lot of the classes were filled, and which was kind of a funny thing because it's like my first experience in college, and then I get there and all the classes are filled. I'm a little late. I'm just kind of scrambling to get enrolled in something for my first semester. I was actually really wanted to be in this Celtic Irish folk song history class.
Wow.
At Evergreen, they have these programs that aren't necessarily traditional classes, but they're called a program.
They've got quite a different model, don't they, at Evergreen?
Yeah. So instead of having like a subject that you're studying one subject, they might have a theme for a program, and then you study all the different subjects around that theme. Like the theme of the program that I wanted to be in was about Celtic music and Celtic folklore and poetry. Yep. And whatnot. And so I was like, oh, that sounds great. Celtic Irish music theory, learning about the history and the ethnomusicology of it all. Yeah. And I thought that was fascinating. It was the only class that was one of the classes that I wanted. And then that ended up being full. And so I was like, okay, what do I do now? Okay, I might as well jump onto something that sounds cool. And there was like a couple things open. And one of the things that drew me in was this program that had like 2 spots left in it. It was called Into the Woods. Community, conflict, and alliance. And I didn't know what I was getting into. And so I thought, okay, that sounds interesting. I like forests. So that changed my whole trajectory in life.
Very briefly, what's the elevator pitch for that curriculum or that theme?
So the theme of the program was just that it's community, conflict, and alliance. So what it talked about was there was different case studies. In particular, we were living, Olympia, Washington is in the Pacific Northwest of North America. And there's a huge amount of logging and deforestation that happens up there. And so a lot of the case studies we were studying were the different species of the forest that were being affected by deforestation.
Like Sasquatch?
Potentially. Mostly the spotted owl up there, which is a big theme. And then also we started delving into the indigenous and Native American perspective as well as part of the communities that were being affected. And we got to go study and go on a reservation and learn from the tribes, which was pretty cool. And so it just changed my whole flow, my whole trajectory. I was going through this music thing, ended up playing a lot of music as well. But really my education went from being this, I was 17 years old at the time. I turned 18 in college, and I had no idea what I was up to. I was really into psychedelics and really into music, and I was really into nature, and so that's what drew me into this Into the Woods program. And I ended up just learning about a lot of large scale environmental degradation that I had no idea existed on the earth, and I ended up learning all about these things that are happening on our planet that not many people get to study or hear about or read about unless you kind of do your research. But pretty much anywhere you go on the earth, there's environmental issues happening. And that's really what the program was about, was these community forest conflicts, essentially.
Okay, interesting. Okay, so that's right in your formative years, you got a good taste and eye-opening of that reality. So how old were you when you left Evergreen?
Well, Evergreen was kind of a long experience. I mean, it was a 4-year experience for me, but Evergreen has a unique opportunity where you can take time and go study abroad and get credit for it and do different things. So I ended up going to back home to Hawaii. I was sick of the winter in Washington, so I went home to Hawaii and studied different things, and that's where I learned about permaculture, the word permaculture, and it started infiltrating my awareness. And there was this program that popped up in Maui, right down the road, 10 minutes down the road from my house. There's a permaculture design course. I was one of the only local people in it. It was all people from off island, and a woman named Penny Livingston. From Northern California, and Brock Dolman.
I know those names.
And then this other guy from the Big Island named John Valenzuela. And those 3 were my permaculture, first PDC I took when I was 19.
How old were you when you got to Zaytuna? For those listening, Pat and I originally met at Zaytuna Farm in northern New South Wales, which is the home of the Permaculture Research Institute of Australia, led by Jeff and Nadia Lawton. I was teaching there at the time. I think I spent a year there as woofer coordinator and nursery manager and teacher in general. And you came on an internship, right, in 2010?
It was actually 2011.
2011.
It was in October 2011. And but prior to that, I had seen Jeff Lawton's films at my PDC in Maui in 2010. The year before that, I had seen Jeff Lawton's films, and it blew my mind. I had no idea that permaculture was this beautiful thing, and it's just to see what was going on in Australia, and that made me really want to go visit Jeff. And then I ended up getting college credit from Evergreen to go visit Jeff.
Oh, cool.
And do all that internship and get some of my last credits. And then after Jeff's program, I came back home to Hawaii and studied with more permaculture experts here, and started getting into grafting and nursery propagation and more plant studies. And then ended up finishing my last credits in college with an arborist, learning about pruning trees and cutting trees and all of that.
So would you say that of all the different areas and sub-threads of permaculture and regenerative agriculture and all those related studies, would it be fair to say that you lean toward the horticultural side of things as opposed to buildings, animals, people systems, that kind of thing. Is that fair?
Definitely. Yeah. Even right before I discovered permaculture, I'd already been into gardening.
Yeah.
Just living in the tropics here in Hawaii, we have lots of fruit trees, and my dad planted trees when I was a little kid, and been starting to eat from those trees at a young age, and experience what that feels like.
Growing up in Maui, did you and your dad, did he have any connection to Terence McKenna and his arboretum on Maui?
No, well, oh, that's an interesting. I'll tell another side story to that. But yeah, my dad never knew about Terence McKenna. It was actually my older brother who told me about Terence McKenna. We used to listen to him on YouTube, to all his old raps and his talks. We used to listen. I was about 13, 14, 15, just starting to get into, cannabis.
Yep.
Yeah, my brother, he introduced me to Terence. And then later in life, side story, I actually met a man here. I won't reveal anyone's name, but I met a man here who trained with Terence McKenna. He was one of Terence's students in Hawaii.
Right.
Terence taught him everything he knew, and pretty much. And to this day, I'm in touch with this friend of mine, and he's who introduced me to ayahuasca.
The McKenna brothers, I believe, on Hawaii. What was it called? I forget the name. But they started at an arboretum, a garden of South American or worldwide. But
Botanical Dimensions, it's called.
Yes, Botanical Dimensions.
Yeah, it's on the Big Island of Hawaii.
Oh, it's on the Big Island. I thought it was on Maui. Okay, right.
Yeah, but Terence did come here on and off. He had several friends throughout the island.
Is ayahuasca embedding itself in local culture to a degree?
There pretty much anywhere you go in the world, I think there's people that are working with the medicine now. I myself was exposed to psychedelics at a young age, just growing up in the hippie culture, and I had dabbled in all the different things from LSD to mushrooms and all that, and I'm not afraid to talk about that at all.
That's a major thread of discussion on this podcast, so go nuts.
I think that's really what drew me to Evergreen was my work with psychedelics at a young age, being mid-teens. I really went off on that path at a young age, and the earth showed itself to me and revealed more and more, and that's what drew me to Evergreen. That's what drew me to permaculture. And then when I discovered ayahuasca, was here in Maui, and through this friend who is Terence's friend, and he really took me under his wing. He had a nephew who was my good friend, and so his nephew and I were kind of his apprentices. And I've been not really heavily involved in that since I've had children. Been so busy with kids, but it's still a part of our life, and I appreciate that the plants, we have access to the plants here in Hawaii.
Are you aware of any indigenous psychedelic plants, fungi, or otherwise to the Hawaiian Islands?
As far as I know, there are not any psychoactive plants that the Hawaiians would consume except for ava, or what people call kava, which is a narcotic. It's more of a physical relaxant, and more like maybe opium or something. But it's not a psychoactive plant. It doesn't affect the mind. It affects the body more, but not at the point of being psychoactive, I think.
Okay. And so Maui ecology is quite interesting, isn't it? From what I understand, and I'm by no means an expert on it, but Maui is a relatively small island, but because of its elevation changes and its topography, different parts of the island foster quite different and varied ecological types and biomes. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's a subtropical climate here, but we have these radical valleys called the Valley Isle, actually. And we have a 10,000-foot mountain in which snows occasionally. And I'm at just below 1,000 feet here, probably around 900 feet elevation. And so it gets a little chilly in the evenings and the mornings. I would say, I don't know the Celsius, but it's in the low 60s in the early morning, which is a little chilly, but not cold.
There are certain faces of the island that are arid or semi-arid. Is that correct?
Yeah, like right now. Yeah, right now we're in the due north end, and just to the ocean from us is cliffs. Like you drive down the road, and then you go all the way down to the end of the road, and then it's just cliffs, like maybe a 200-foot tall cliff to the ocean. That's real cliffy coastline here. And then just above us is forests for miles and miles and miles, wild forest. They're invasive species that were brought here. They're not native species. So most of the island is covered in non-native trees.
There were studies done. The novel ecosystems of Maui are quite well known within those circles who pay attention to those things. It's quite diverse exotic species that now make up the plant population there, isn't it? The climax population.
And because we're on the windward side, which means we get the brunt of the open ocean wind and rain, we're on the rainy side. We just call it the wet side.
Yeah.
And so from here, you drive maybe 30 minutes around the mountain, and they get 5 inches of rain a year, and it's dry and sunny and hot and barren, and very different trees and grass species that grow there. It's more like a African savanna looking.
Are there areas that you would say that approximate a Mediterranean climate in some respects, like a mid-coast California climate?
Yeah, so if you just go up the mountain from here, up and around a little bit, it gets a lot colder, and then it gets a little bit drier. And so you have all these different climates that are just like California, and sometimes it snows up there. And then where we are, it's subtropics, so it's not quite tropics, not humid tropics. You can get the chill a little bit, so it's kind of more. It's not even jungle; it's more forest here.
It sounds actually somewhat equivalent to the Shannon in northern New South Wales where we first met. So it's
very similar.
It's subtropical, but because of the valleys, you can actually get cooler weather.
Yeah, exactly. But it doesn't get below. It doesn't get chilly. You don't get any frost where I am.
Right. But so like on a small island, it's like 1,800 square kilometers or something like that. You have subtropical, Mediterranean, semi-arid and alpine ecosystems or microclimates. So It's one of those places where you could grow a huge diversity of crops and animals and have a huge diversity of systems all within a couple of days walk from one another.
Yeah, completely. Yeah.
Are people doing that at all? Like, are there systems there? And I hope to speak about the more traditional Hawaiian island systems. But when people think of the Hawaiian Islands, they think of, hula skirts and pineapples and Welcome to Jurassic Park.
Right. They don't realize that we have these wild forests.
What's your understanding of the history of the Hawaiian Islands or Maui in terms of the indigenous there? I understand you're not speaking for them. You're not indigenous Hawaiian, but what's your grasp, having lived there for 25 years?
Yeah, and I've done a lot of research over the years, and just grown up around the stories and the people, and some of my best friends are Hawaiian. Most of them don't like to be called Hawaiian even anymore. They want to be called Kanaka Maoli, which is the traditional term. Kanaka means human or man, and then Maoli. Ooh, I'm getting a flash flood warning on my phone. Wow.
What was that?
It says on my phone, I'm getting a flash flood warning. It says Kapakalua Dam failure in Haiku area. Evacuate if downstream. Repeat now.
Is that you?
No, there's a large dam.
Yeah, but is that you? Do you have to evacuate?
No, not at all. I'm up on a hill.
Yeah, but that's not good, man. If there's a big dam about to blow.
I know. Yeah. Wow. Crazy. It's a pretty big valley that the dam is in. So I don't think anybody will be injured. This is pretty. So we're on an interesting spot here. It's like we live on a big hilltop up here. We're actually on like a pinnacle view. We can look down and see all the area around us, and we're on this rolling hills, and we're up on the top of the hill. And then just around us is cow pastures.
Right.
And so we're like in this really exposed, windy spot. Actually, we get a ton of wind on my hillside.
Yeah.
And then just below is kind of rolling pastures into jungle and forests. And all around where I live used to be native koa and ohia forest, these are endemic trees that were all cut down for cattle space, and then all logged for the beautiful fine wood.
Same old story.
And so all this area was once forested in fern forest and all these native exotic trees that you don't see much anymore. And then now, and in the valleys below, I'm looking out my window right now, and there's rolling pastures that head down toward a valley. And at the edge of the cow pasture valley, there's a barbed wire fence, and then on the other side of that fence is this 100-foot to 200-foot deep valley with a river flowing wild through it. And wild pigs everywhere, wild deer.
Okay, so like that's some of the wild protein you have running around, deer and pig.
Yeah, we like to hunt them. Yeah.
Yeah. Something that I've noticed and appreciated following your work over the last few years is how hands-on you and your community seem to be, and how engaging you guys are in connecting with the traditional systems of the island, which are obviously extremely well adapted to the ecology
Yeah.
for obvious reasons. The traditional systems of Hawaii, they've been, I'm going to butcher this pronunciation. Was it Ahupua?
It's the Ahupua system.
Ahupua. Okay, I'm not even going to try it again.
It's two words, and the word is Ahu, 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 and that in traditional in ancient history, that the Ahu is the altar,
right?
Like an altar that you place something, and then the word for pig is pua'a, pua'a,
right?
Puaa, pua'a, and so the Ahupua is the pig altar, and that's where they would take all the produce and all the harvest for the season. When they would share with the kings and the chiefs that lived around they were like the commoners growing the food. The ancient Hawaiian people, they had a different caste system of commoners and chiefs.
Right.
And the chiefs had like sub chiefs that were like land manage the areas. They were kind of like the landlords of the area.
Right.
And then they would have the Ahupua where they would place all the produce to offer to the chiefs that kind of ruled the areas. But it's interesting history, because where I am right now, and I live on on the edges of these valleys, and just down in the valleys, there's these ancient archaeological rock stonework gardens that have been overgrown in vegetation for 120 something years, or more in some cases, and so we're around this area where there was a high population of indigenous Hawaiians that were living completely off the land for generations, 8 generations or more.
And the way they lived off the land, from my understanding, I would categorize the indigenous Hawaiian system within and it's hard to quantify or qualify these things, but within the top 5 off the top of my head, most sustainable, regenerative, resilient, and abundant traditional eco-agricultural systems in the world. So would you give us like a brief rundown of how it works? Like, my understanding is that a family group or a tribal group would inherit a particular watershed, and they had a very specific way of utilizing different parts of that watershed. Is that accurate?
For sure, yeah. So every different area or zone of elevation in the forest was used for different things, essentially. Whereas most of the Hawaiians lived on the ocean, because it was the warmest, and they had an abundant fish life, food for them.
So the village would be down by the water's edge. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yeah, there was definitely home sites all throughout the elevations, but a lot of the people they were ocean people. So most of them were down near the ocean, and then they would gather their forest stuff up in the upcountry zone, where they would cut down big trees for their canoes that they would float down the streams and bring to the ocean, where they made open ocean canoes. Mm-hmm. And then they had medicines and things that they harvested in the forests, and different fibers for weaving and for making cordage and their clothes and everything. They were really industrious people, and all that remains of their culture in our area really is these old stone walls that I see all around. And what happened, to go back to the Hawaiian history that you asked me about earlier, the history of Hawaii is really unique because there's a lot of awareness now that the islands were never legally changed. The kingdom of Hawaii, was never really, they didn't cede their lands legally or lawfully by international law, that is. And so a lot of that awareness is coming up now. And a lot of my Hawaiian friends are realizing that they can find where their families used to live, and ancestrally, and they can go back there and open those places. And there's something specific I want to touch upon there, because in the late 1840s, there was an act that was passed. There was actually a legislature in Hawaiian Kingdom. The Hawaiian monarchy had its own parliament and legislature, and so they passed an act called the Kuleana Awards Act. And what that meant was kuleana is the word for responsibility or privilege in Hawaii, kuleana. And that also is an early form of land ownership in Hawaii, because previously when the white man arrived, there was no land ownership by anybody privately. It was all owned by the ali'i, by the chiefs.
Right.
And there was these, like I said, there was these landlords, these sub-chiefs who would manage all the production of the lands by the commoners. And that was the form of land management, was a monarchy system.
Yeah.
And so, and then when the white folks got here, they wanted to own land. And they also started taking all the resources pretty early on, and leasing acreage. They lease different parcels from the crown. And so they started wanting to purchase these leased lands from the crown. And the Hawaiian kingdom realized, okay, we got to do something so that our people can get something too. And so they passed this act called the Kuleana Awards Act, where a Hawaiian family could write down a claim, a land claim, and if they could write or read back then, which is pretty rare. But a lot of Hawaiians could write and read. It was a very illiterate society, actually, because early on there was a push. The Hawaiian kingdom pushed for literacy, right, because they realized they needed to be aware of they needed to be a player in the international game.
Yep. And
so, and interrupt me if you have any questions along the way. But this is a really important piece to our work.
Yeah. You rant.
There's this Kuleana Awards Act, and so what the Hawaiian family would do is they would write down in cursive Hawaiian. They'd write down a detailed claim of their area. Like, say they'd been living on this one spot for generations, and they'd say, okay, I want to go claim this land. They'd write down the claim, they'd go down to the courthouse, whatever. This claim would be mailed by steamship to the king on another island, and King Kamehameha III, and he would approve of these awards. And so they were awarded like a number, like they call it a land claim award number, LCA number. And now it's an early form of tax map, TMK numbers in Hawaii. So this is where we're getting into the land ownership early on.
Yeah.
And so Hawaiian families actually had their own legal form of TMK land ownership, their own deed to the land, essentially. And when, at the time of the illegal overthrow that happened when the U.S. military came in by gunpoint, they came and took the queen on house arrest.
By force.
They made her sign these documents that changed the laws and proclaimed themselves as a provisional government. They formed they had a military coup that happened, and they were backed by Grover Cleveland, and they were backed by Congress, by U.S. Congress. The U.S. Congress said, okay, we'll recognize this group of white people as the new government. And they were they were the grandsons of the missionaries that came, and they were farmers. They were the people who came to take the water for large-scale agriculture that still exists today. That's the important part to get into more, is that the agricultural establishment here still exists. It's gone from hand to hand.
Yeah. And
what happened was that the peoples that lived on these little land claims, they were forced to leave, and they were told that they couldn't live there anymore, essentially, and their water was taken away by dams and diversion systems that were built, and they just didn't have the water to flow to their gardens anymore, so they had to leave and go find work elsewhere. Some of them died from disease, who knows, to find work as well. They left these valleys, and so the valleys remain empty, and so now you have these huge swaths of land where there once was high populations of people farming and living off of what they grew, and now it's all under weeds and invasive species that were brought in for the past 100 years.
So when you and your friends and the current generation of islanders return to these places, is that what you see? It's just like dense, overgrown, like quote unquote weeds smothering everything in valleys. Is that what it looks like?
Dense vegetation.
Yeah.
Yeah. And what we've been doing lately is this. So about 2 years ago this month, actually, I was introduced to a couple Hawaiian sisters. These two sisters are from an area called Keanai, which is on the northeast side of the island. It's about a 45-minute drive from here along the coast toward Hana. And it's a remote valley where the Hana Highway is a really famous road. And actually the road systems themselves were created by these sugar cane farmers in the late 1800s. The whole road system was made by these planters too. So we're driving on this road that actually follows an old irrigation tunnel.
Right.
And so we're out in this remote valley, and all along this coastline are these massive valleys that go from mountain to ocean, mountain to ocean. Oops, getting another warning.
Another warning.
Gotta turn my phone off here. Sorry.
That's cool.
They're opening a shelter for people who need shelter places because the rain is wild. But yeah, so all along the mountainside here is a huge amount of water, and that's why we have these warnings going off, because we have a really, really incredible mountainside that the water comes off of here is unlike anywhere else in the world, and actually has the highest recorded rainfall on Earth.
Right.
It's from this one spot. People think it's Kauai or West Maui, but there was this spot that was 560 something inches of rain in one year. This whole mountainside here is really abundant in rain. And in the late 1800s, these sugar planters, they built these incredibly sophisticated and diverse, very technical and advanced, really, for the time, aqueduct systems to divert water from the valleys away from the rainy side all the way to the dry side of the island, where you get these big, flat, open plains where it's real sunny.
Ah, interesting. How did they construct them? You don't have to go into detail. Is it just concrete, cement?
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. It's a whole network of four-wheel drive roadways through the bush,
right,
up on the mountains, and it's several different elevations. You can look at a map of Maui and see these contour swale-looking like ditches that go all around the mountains at several different elevations. Sometimes it's 4 different ditches at 4 different contour elevations.
They multi-function as roads as well?
Yeah, and that's how our road system was created back in the day. Yeah,
that's interesting. So that's kind of on keyline. That's a keyline patterning. So they're taking water from the valley, and the road drain is going slightly downhill towards the ridge, and it wraps around the ridge, going downhill, and then it feeds the next valley, which is drier.
Pretty incredible. And so, well, essentially, this whole side of the island is wet, though. Like, every single valley is flooding and, like, raging when it rains. And so they take all this water, and they actually learned about it. I've been reading about it over the years. They actually learned this system from the Hawaiians, because the Hawaiians have these similar intricate designs where they feed their wetland taro patches, and they feed they're like big rice paddies.
Yeah.
And the Hawaiians, they discovered this, or they carried this information from with them across from island to island, but it was really developed here in Hawaii, had the most sophisticated wetland taro production here anywhere else in the world.
Those paddies on the other side of the island that are now irrigated, are they considerably fertile now? Are they really productive?
Well, that's where I live. I live on the wet side. So every valley around me right now has those ancient lo'i. They're called lo'i, and they're wetland, flat, terraced gardens that were once fed by these irrigation ditches. So the Hawaiians had their own form of irrigation ditches where they dammed the stream a bit, but they would take the water. They would only take a little bit of the water, and then the water would go back to the stream after it left their system. But these systems that were made by these white folks that came over, these sugar planters, Klaus Spreckels, Sanford Dole from Dole Pineapple Company, all these, these were aqueduct systems that permanently remove the water from the stream. So downstream from the diversion was dry.
Oh, like they took all the water.
All the water.
Okay, and is that still the case?
To this day, that's still the case.
Oh, wow.
All the water goes to the dry part of the island and for sugarcane and pineapple production. And the sugarcane is exported. And so, but just a few years ago in 2016, 2017, the sugarcane company closed. They stopped their operation. There was so much pushback from their chemical agriculture that they had to stop what they were doing, and they literally just shut down because they were being subsidized for so many years too that they weren't able to produce much, and it was just ruining the land in chemical agriculture. And so what happened recently is they sold the land to a new company, and they changed the name from Hawaii Commercial and Sugar to Mahi Pono, which is a Hawaiian. Those are Hawaiian words. Mahi is to farm or plant, or to garden, mahi. And then pono is the word for balance or like righteousness. What is right? What's pono? And so they literally, what they did is they sold this massive company as well as the water rights, as well as all these aqueducts. They sold the water rights to this new company, And the new company is actually based out of Canada and California. They're monocropping chemical companies there as well.
Right.
And essentially what's been going on is that company that sold, they were called Alexander and Baldwin. And they were the Baldwin family. That's the family that owns most of the land here still. And what's happening on the islands is that most of the land went into agriculture historically. And then from agriculture to real estate. And then have these huge areas of land where all the homes are, especially where I am now, where I live.
Yeah.
All this land was once agriculture and cattle and all these, and sugarcane and pineapple. And now it's just exploding in homes.
That's a fairly common pattern around the world.
Exactly. And then they're pretending that, oh, we're trying to diversify. Instead of just sugarcane, they're saying, oh, no, we're going to diversify ag. And so now they're growing coffee and citrus, and they're kind of planting out various things, but they have like 1,000 acres of citrus and 1,000 acres of that. And it's like rows and rows of just dirt blowing in the wind. And they spray pesticides and herbicides and all.
It's just lip service to the concept of regeneration.
Exactly. And they're just pretending. We call it fake ag here. We call it fake ag. And so that's what we're dealing with now is the same situation it still is happening to the Hawaiians they've been withstanding all this, enduring all this trauma to their land and their culture, which was based on homesteading in a valley. And their whole way of life was transformed because of these sugar planters.
These systems, like the traditional systems, like within a watershed, within a valley. So my understanding is that they had at the top of the catchment, up the top of the hill, they would have the concept of the sacred or taboo forest, which wasn't touched. Is that accurate?
It is accurate. However, they utilized every ecosystem for purposes. So it's not that it was taboo at all, but it was that you had to have a specific purpose or reason to go there.
I see.
And so a lot of the medicine men, the kahuna, or the shamans, or you call them shamans, or the experts in certain medicines or in certain things like the people who looked at the stars to navigate. They would go to these places to find to have spiritual connections or study the landscape, and they'd also go to these places to gather their medicines and fibers too. So it wasn't that it was completely kapu.
It wasn't as cultivated. It was like a zone 4 in permaculture nomenclature, or a zone 5 even, that you'd sustainably gather from.
Exactly. Yeah. However, there were trail systems around the island that the Hawaiians would hike over the mountains to get to the dry side, and they would trade for salt for their produce because it rains so much where we live over here that they can't get salt from the ocean. It doesn't dry. The puddles don't dry. So on this dry side of the island, they can make big calabashes of salt water, and they would sit them in the sun and dry them and make salt.
How long would it take to walk from one side to the other through the guts if it was doable?
I mean, it really just depends on what route you take.
In terms of trading on foot, is it a couple of days?
Yeah, days.
Yeah, like that scale of magnitude, 2, 3, 4 days? Okay.
Oh, yeah. Definitely, yeah. And it's so wild and rough because of the overgrowth, too. I imagine that back when the Hawaiians, when the Kanaka were out, they had trail systems They
would have maintained a trail system. Yeah, it's much the same here in Australia. In fact, most of our roads are actually originally the indigenous walking trails, become the colonial walking trails, which become the horse and cart trails, which are then paved, and then the highways.
Traditionally, there was a trail system around the whole island called the Alaloa. The Alaloa, the long trail. And it was called the King's Highway. And along the King's Highway, it was paved with stones.
Right, they paved.
They paved them with lava rock stones. So it was a perfect trail for the chiefs to walk, and they were probably carried. And along the Galaloa, they would have the Ahupua. They'd have the altars, the pig altars. And that's where the chiefs would come and make their yearly rounds. They would walk all the way around the island and check on. It's an early form of land management. So they would check on all the resources. They would check in with the local chiefs, say, how's your watershed doing? And we want to come and see how you're doing, because if it's not productive and you're not keeping it up, we're going to get someone else. We're going to kill you and get someone else involved to head. That was how serious they were sometimes.
That's pretty incentivizing.
If they didn't keep it together, they were offed, and another person was put in their place to manage things.
Right.
And that was so that the land would always be abundant. And the chiefs were They weren't stupid. They knew about land management. They knew about permaculture back then. They knew that they needed to sustain their communities.
Their system is, I don't think it's as recognized as it should be, but frankly, that whole study isn't as recognized as it should be. And for what it's worth, I think I've mentioned it to you before. I'm actually writing a documentary series on pre-industrial traditional eco-agricultural systems of the world.
Ooh.
And the Hawaiian system is like up in the top 4 that I want to focus on, along with the Shinampas and the Dahesa and others. So I hope to haul my Australian butt over there sooner than later. And so downhill then from the sacred forest, you'd have like a more productive forest system. What kind of species of forestry tree crops would they cultivate traditionally?
Well, below the actual alpine zone at the summit of the mountain is just shrubbery.
A what? A shrubbery!
Right.
Which has certain shrubs that they would harvest for hardwood and whatnot. But just below that is the forest of the gods. They call it the Valakua.
Yeah.
And that has this huge swath of koa and other hardwood trees that they would use for their posts for building their homes. And then also their canoes. But that honestly, that line would go from like 8,000 feet to like almost to the ocean.
Right.
So literally the forest zone was like the majority of the mountain.
Right.
And then you have these other zones in the streams below those ridges where they'd farm their wetland crops and all that. And just below where I live, I'm looking down in the valley right now. Just below here is an ancient stone archaeological system that is just overgrown. Like every single valley is overgrown.
Man, what an adventure to be able to go back as an individual or as a family or family group of friends and reclaim and rediscover and unearth and give new life to these systems. That's so cool. It reminds me, was Sylvia Floresta from Portugal on your internship?
Maybe.
She's great. She's gone on to do amazing things. And in Portugal and Spain, you've got these permaculture kids, these kind of punk anarchist permaculture collectives just going back to the old abandoned villages and, cutting away the overgrowth and reestablishing them.
I can't imagine how many of my fellow students I can't imagine what they're doing. It's amazing. I'm sure that there's so much more going on, even just in the 10 years since I was there.
It was an amazing experience. I mean, the amount of incredible people who would roll through. It was one of the most invigorating year and a bit of my life. How invigorating the conversation is, and just everyone's so passionate about it and so full of meaning at the time. And, there were some negative lessons learned as well in the less than romantic side of that whole scene. But largely speaking, those kind of communities are very invigorating and inspiring to be amongst because of the passion and the applied meaning.
Honestly, I hope to make my own education center like that someday on my own family farm here that I've been developing.
Well, go for it, mate. I think you got everything going for you.
Yeah, it's I have children now, and I've got these 3 boys that my oldest boy is 4.5.
Yeah, you got to get past that little kid stage. That's fair.
That's where I'm at now. Really, the kids are involved, though. I mean, we go out to this valley that we restore these taro patches at Honolulu Bay. We bring all the kids, and then the other friends of mine bring their kids. So it's just a big family experience, and we go every weekend for an afternoon, from pretty much morning till afternoon.
And what you guys grow now, like taro is a famous staple crop of the Polynesians and the Hawaiian Islanders. What other, like the tree crops? I'm interested in the staple tree crops, like in the traditional systems, what would they have been growing? So I'll paint the larger picture. You've got the sacred forest up the top. You've got more productive forest down slope. And then as the toe of the slope breaks into the flatter areas where the water accumulates, you've got taro beds and animals, chickens, pigs.
We farm dogs for food, actually.
And what? Dog?
Dogs, yeah, that was one of their main foods.
Oh gosh, okay, yeah, I've never had the pleasure of eating dog. And then the villages down by the water, as you said before, the main concentration of peoples was by the water. And then they had quite ingenious fish traps, didn't they?
Yeah.
Off the mouth of the stream as it would enter.
And that's the cool thing about our location at this bay we're restoring the gardens at. It's an estuary. We're at the ocean. We park at the ocean and we walk down the sand, and we're at our farm now. That's not where I live, but that's where we work every week.
Right. So the species of the tree crops, what were the traditional tree crops growing there in the old systems?
For food, they were farming bread, what they call breadfruit.
Breadfruit. Okay. That's a moraceae, isn't it? Like a jackfruit mulberry relative.
Yeah, it's related to jackfruit. It's Artocarpus is the genus, and it is the chief staple starch.
Right.
It's just like taro, or we call it kalo. Taro is kalo in Hawaii. The word taro comes from Tahiti, and then kalo is what they call it in Hawaii.
Okay.
So the ulu, the breadfruit, is a tree kalo, pretty much. It's a tree starch, and you cook it green, and it's just like a potato. It's amazing. You can put it in all kinds of things, and they had like forests and forests of this stuff.
Yeah.
The famous groves they talk about on the islands that were actually cut down for industrial agriculture back in the day. There's some that remained here and there, but
that's fucking tragic. There are many things that break my heart, but when I hear of traditional tree crop systems being cut down for something fucking stupid, that pisses me off.
This is an insane situation on this island. We have the most abundant rainfall and productive, fertile soil ever.
Yeah. Rain, you've got volcanic soil, you've got varied microclimates.
And huge amounts of mulch. I mean, the forests are relatively untouched.
Biomass looks absolutely incredible. And then, of course, all the seafood resources, sea resources.
Yeah. I mean, I'm one of the few people who grew up hiking and exploring around where I live. I mean, there's people that hike around, but I've done so much exploring around where I live, and I rarely ever see anybody out there. It's like wild forest where I live. I live on the edge. I'm about 1,000 feet elevation. Just beyond where I live above is just the most wild terrain, which is the domain of the pigs and the deer.
Yeah.
And it's huge amounts of mulch. It's ridiculous. So for me, like, there's huge opportunities for permaculture here, and I'm focusing on my own farm as well.
It seems to me like it's one of those hotspots around the world for all the reasons we've mentioned. If people decided to and had the political and social will and the capital and whatever else, that Maui of all places could absolutely hum.
Oh, for sure, and so that's where we're at now. Is that the Hawaiians, they were masters of their farming, and so I'm actually, because I'm so knowledgeable about the agricultural part, I'm now connecting. I'm now connecting with Hawaiians who want to learn that about their lineage. They don't know those skills, but I've been practicing and studying them. And there's a ton of Hawaiians out there who are wanting to reconnect with their roots, and that's where these Hawaiian sisters that I met, these young, they're like in their early 30s. These women that I know, they really spearheaded this project. It was a woman organization. It was just these two girls, and like, they're pretty rowdy Hawaiians. Like, they don't take shit from nobody, and they go around and they'll get arrested for squatting on a property where there's a bulldozer and chain themselves to the bulldozer. You know, like they'll go and do these things, and they'll make a scene about it and post it on social media. You know, like they're the kind of girls. They're activist girls.
Is that sub-thread? Is that subculture of like Hawaiian secession or autonomy and sovereignty and traditional culture? Is that making a comeback? Do you see it growing?
Definitely. I think there's a lot of people who are waking up to realizing that there's the Hawaiian overthrow was never legal. It was never lawful. Their land was taken without permission.
It's got to be unconstitutional, surely.
For sure. And because the land is just becoming degraded by development, it's becoming more and more, and now people can't even afford to live here. Like, the people who are the ancestral lineal descendants from the area, they have to find another place to live. Or, they have to leave the island because they can't afford to live here. It's like, I think $860,000 is the average median price for a family home now. However, $860,000, like just under $1 million.
The US in general, like minimum wage, you can't afford anything but a trailer park around the US.
Exactly. And so a lot of the Hawaiians I'm in touch with now, this small group, they're like, let's go back to our family land. Let's go find where our great-great-grandparents were farming, and let's go open that shit up.
Is there anyone making a conventional legal case? Like in Australia, we have the history of the Mabo.
Yeah, I've been reading that book.
Eddie Mabo court case, the native title decision, where he demonstrated that Indigenous Australian Aboriginals and Torres Strait Islanders, they had a form of land stewardship, which negated the whole terra nullius claim, which is it's a whole story, and it's evil in my approximation.
I'm actually reading that book right now, Eddie Mabo's book.
It's a landmark case. I mean, it's of serious importance, culturally, anthropologically, legally, magically. It's a big deal. But I'm curious, like, because you guys on the islands, there is a pretty strong legal case that
Short answer is no.
no one's doing that. All right. That surprises me.
There are people challenging it. And so there are people challenging it. And most of them are people who've been arrested for protesting and chaining themselves to certain things, like Standing Rock kind of thing. Like there's the whole thing on Mauna Kea. I don't know if you know about what happened on Mauna Kea.
Yeah.
The big mountain.
Yeah, sorry.
Where they have the telescopes. So since then, in 2015, all throughout the decades, there's been protests because of the telescopes.
Yeah. I remember Jason Momoa made a big deal about it.
Yeah, Jack Johnson went up there. It was a big deal. Like all these artists went up there. So what happened was the Hawaiian people were like, this is our sacred volcano, our pico. It's like a sacred spot on the top of the hill, and you are desecrating it essentially. And they started realizing that, hey, they didn't even have legal title to begin with.
Right.
It was just taken. So now there's this huge wave of education. Like the Hawaiians are getting educated now.
Watch for the usual gameplay. What will usually occur is there'll be bad marketing, and the people who are now fighting for or insisting on traditional Indigenous recognition and return to a recognition and a practice of that, they'll start being conflated with terrorists or something, fascists or.
Yeah, we're seeing that, and a lot of the Hawaiians that I'm hanging out with, they're tired of struggling with the financial system. They're tired of struggling to make rent or whatever. They're like, they just want to go and find where their legal land is essentially. And so there are these places where the Kuleana Awards, like you can go and find that, hey, my great grandfather had a parcel.
Uh-huh.
And if you go online to the website, I'll show you sometime. You can search the number. Yeah. It's like a PMK number. You can search the number, and they have a Google map of it. They have this Hawaiian website they made, and it's a Google map image, and it shows where they are. Huh. And then you click on it. There's a bunch of black and white cursive images, and then they have it translated into English, and it says what they were growing and how many acres they had of taro and how many trees they had of this. Yeah. And it shows they had a home site, whatever. And so what's happening now is these Hawaiians are realizing that, hey, I actually have a home. I actually have a place to go that was my family's.
So many people are longing for that now. I think humanity in general is getting fucking sick of the feeling of being short stay tenants to some invisible landlord. Right, and not being able to put down roots and wrap their arms around a tree and dig their proverbial heels into the ground and say, I belong here and I'm connected to here. The sense of not being entitled to do that, or that being illegitimized because of some magical ritual with a piece of paper and a stamp and someone in a wig or tie or badge or something said so. People are getting fucking tired of that. And that impulse to reconnect with country is growing and growing and growing. And if it's not allowed to express itself in a healthy way, what can't come out straight comes out crooked. And it could come out crooked because I can see that as a kind of collective theme at the moment.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't know how much longer we have here, but I'll just say I want to express too that for me, I get I've gotten some pushback from certain people, certain family members that, hey, I'm just a privileged white kid whose dad bought land here. Why should I, why shouldn't I just leave and give my land back to the Hawaiians? And I feel like, sure, yeah, my dad did buy land here. Get this, tomorrow, the Hawaiian family who's lineally connected to my land here, they're coming over to meet us tomorrow.
Wow.
Because they have a parcel within our parcel.
Right.
That they want to sell to us.
Right.
Because one of their family members is ill. There's an old Hawaiian auntie who's like in her 90s, and they need money. They need money to pay for her medical bills.
Right.
And my dad has just let our horses cruise all over it. It's just a landlocked like acre within our 10 acres.
Right.
And their whole land used to be this whole area, and they've sold off, and they've kept this one little bit. And now they want to sell the last little bit. And so they're coming over to meet us and talk story. And I'm actually, I want to just meet them and like learn about the history really.
Well, I wish you well. I hope that relationship goes as smoothly and fruitfully as possible.
But this is a common theme that the Hawaiian lands are disappearing, and it's because of this fake TMK system that the U.S. government has put in place here, where they've created this whole form of land ownership here that never existed prior to the overthrow. And so, because the law, they didn't have lawful title to begin with, it's becoming aware that it was all fraudulent titles now. So actually, nobody owns the land here. Still, there was no legal title exchange. They just created their own TMK system. So that's where we're at now. We're starting from that, and with that awareness, anybody can really just go out and open whatever land they want. And that's what the Hawaiians that I know are doing. They're going to these wild places that their families used to live 100 years ago.
Yeah.
And they're opening it up, and they're getting things planted, and they're realizing that they need to raise their kids that way. And so that's what I'm doing with my kids. I'm raising my kids in that way and trying to pass on a better life to them,
Oh, the tangled webs we weave. It is complex. I wish you all the best, mate. It is complex, but I see the work you're doing is admirable. It's really cool. So, Pat Simmons Jr., I've had you for long enough, mate. I'll let you go, but thank you so much for the chat. Can you let the listeners know briefly where they can get hold of you or find you? We haven't even mentioned your music. Do you want to throw a website out for the music? Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, prior to the whole COVID thing, I've been a musician my whole life, as well as a plant geek. And that's how I made my income, through music. I have a musical family. My father's a musician, and I'm not afraid to say, my father's in the Doobie Brothers, and he passed on that gift to me. And so, my music is still an ongoing thing during parenting. I'm not playing any shows, but still playing a little music here and there. People can go to my website to learn more about the music, which is just PatSimmonsJr.com. That's PatSimmonsJr.com. And then I'm pretty active on Instagram, not so active on Facebook these days. Just kind of over Facebook, just kind of too much complexity. But Instagram is way easier for me, and I'm so busy throughout my day anyway. I don't have time to go make posts much. So Instagram, if you can find me on there, just Pat Simmons Jr. on Instagram is the best way to find out what I'm up to. And
I'll put them in the show notes. But I would actually encourage you, Pat, I understand you're busy, but what you're sharing on Instagram is actually, like, I'm aware of lots of people doing things around the world, but what you're doing is some of the coolest stuff out there, and visually it's amazing. So I would encourage you to share more of that to the greatest degree you can.
Definitely. And for me, it's just a long haul for my kids. I'm realizing that what I can leave behind for them and how I can raise them close to the land, like how I was raised close to the land. That's what I want to do. And it doesn't matter if you're Hawaiian or white or whatever color or race you are, you can still find a connection where you live and still learn about the plants and still learn, because, we're in a really trippy time. And the more that the kids know how to grow some stuff and survive and maintain their own life from the land, the better off they're going to be.
That's the name of the game at the moment, mate. Reconnection to country. It's going to keep us sane and healthy and happy and well fed.
But there's more music coming too.
Okay. All right. Thanks so much, mate. I appreciate you taking the time. All the best.
Thank you, thanks so much.
See you, buddy.
Aloha.
Aloha. should knuckle down, polish up our battle plans. Head to the hill, shotgun filled cans. Really makes you stop and think. How we fuck away our power. It's got a long, hard, cold stare, casing at the top of it. They'll hang you by your hair until you beg for the end of it. Lavender, 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 lavender. Lavender, 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 lavender. Lavender, 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 lavender. Look at my face when you talk to my breath. What's the matter, kid? You got 20 minutes left. We should knuckle down, polish up our back.